On the night of February 6, 1942, a long column of Japanese destroyers left their South Pacific base at Banville Island and headed down the slot toward the island of Guadalcanal in the Solomons Group. They carried few supplies and little ammunition, for they expected to be back at base in a matter of hours. Their mission was not to carry out an offensive, but to rescue the last of some 177,000 Imperial Japanese troops who were being evacuated from Guadalcanal under the noses of the Americans. After the long battle for control of that island, the Imperial General Staff had just brought the bloody contest to an end. With their decision to withdraw 20 destroyers took part in this rescue mission, 18 of them moving to Guadalcanal, and the other 2 to the Russell Islands off Cape Esperance at the upper tip of the Big Island. They moved skillfully, and they were lucky the American fleet units weren't in the area at that moment, although a large fighting force was at sea. But Admiral William Bull Holly was guarding against a Japanese attack on Guadalcanal, or on New Caledonia, and the fleet was patrolling south of the Solomons. This American force was powerful: 4 battleships, 3 auxiliary carriers, 5 cruisers, and a dozen destroyers. But it was in a defensive, not an offensive posture. Admiral Robert G. Finn, commander of the Cruiser Task Force 18, was more concerned with the intentions of the Japanese than with launching an all-out search for any enemy vessels on February 6th. Allied coast watchers sighted the Japanese ships and reported to Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, and several air attacks were launched. The bombers claimed to have damaged at least 2 of the Japanese destroyers. But the planes did not stop them from carrying out their mission, and like grey ghosts, the destroyers slid in toward shore. The pitiful, starving remnants of the Japanese military units swam or floated out and climbed up the cargo nets thrown over the sides of the destroyers. Many men were so weak they had to be helped aboard, and then long before dawn the destroyers turned their bows toward Banville and were gone on the morning of February 7th. Not a single organized Japanese unit remained on Guadalcanal. In 3 nights the Japanese Navy had removed an entire army force from Guadalcanal without the Americans even having a hint of the master plan. The destroyer Makig Gumo was lost, and 3 others were damaged by Allied air CFT. But that was a small price to pay for saving almost 2 divisions. It was several days before the Americans learned the truth. So swiftly and silently had the Japanese moved on February 9th in Tokyo. Imperial General Headquarters issued a communique about the Solomons battle. Until that time, few in Japan knew how badly the struggle had gone, although there had been rumors that the ever-victorious Imperial forces were having some difficulties. But no one expected this communique. Although couched in the most euphonious of terms, it told the story of a dreadful defeat, and the shock of it began to reverberate throughout the empire to those who understood the complex Japanese military system. The fact that this communique did not deal with naval matters at all was understandable. Navy and Army kept their own secrets, and the Navy section of the Imperial General Staff gave out very little information, and most of that misleading, for example, after the serious defeat of the Japanese Navy at the Battle of Midway. The Navy concealed even from Prime Minister Tojo the extent of the defeat for an entire month. The excuse was that it was more important to deny the enemy access to accurate casualty figures about the Navy than about the Army. But no matter how one read the Imperial Communique of February 9th, it was bad news for Japan. For the first time the government admitted that Japanese forces had been hard hit in the Solomons. The struggle had begun, said the communique, in the summer of 1942, and it had affected the lower section of the Solomons and the New Guinea area. The enemy had arrived in great force, and after fierce fighting had forced the Japanese defense units to establish new bases for the conduct of operations in New Guinea. The new base was in the neighborhood of Lee, and from here the Imperial Japanese forces intended to move forward and take all of Papua. This new base had been established in the first 10 days of February, and so had several others in the Central Solomons. The communique went into some detail about the struggle for Guadalcanal, indicating that a huge American force had simply overpowered the brave defenders of Japan. The communique also gave some comparative war loss figures for both sides to show that although Japan had been pushed out of Guadalcanal, the cost to the Americans had been enormous. The enemy said the communique had lost more than 25,000 men, 23 aircraft, 30 field guns, and 25 tanks. The Japanese had lost only 734 men, including those who died from disease, and 139 planes. Nothing was said about the Navy's situation, except that the Navy had fought a magnificent battle, but about the loss of hundreds of Navy planes and of many ships from battleships to destroyers. Imperial headquarters said nothing. Even those who could read between the lines could only sense the magnitude of the defeat, and they had no way of knowing that the comparative figures were false. Moreover, the communique gave no background and failed to mention the enormous argument that was in progress just then in Tokyo about the direction of the war, the controversy centered around Guadalcanal, and the difficulties the Japanese military establishment had encountered for the first time. To meet the American threat, the Japanese had pulled the 41st Division of the Imperial Army out of China and the 20th Division out of Korea. Two other divisions, the 6th and the 51st, were also moved from other southern areas to Rabaul to be committed to the Solomons and New Guinea operations toward the end of December 1942. A growing quarrel between the War Ministry on the one hand and the Imperial Army High Command on the other broke into the open for the first time in the past. The War Ministry had been responsible for the political aspects of defence as well as the maintenance of production and liaison between the government and the army. The High Command had been given untrammelled authority over operations. If the High Command wanted more ships from the civilian economy, it went to the War Ministry and got them until Guadalcanal there, when the Americans began sinking ships by the dozen. The problem came into sharp focus. There were not enough ships to go around. The Army needed another 300,000 tons of shipping for 1943 to send troops and supplies to Guadalcanal. The War Minister looked at the total defence problem of Japan and said no. The Army's General Shinichi Tanaka, chief of the Operations Bureau, rose up in fury, and never before had the Army been denied a major request. General Tanaka lost his temper with the War Minister, forgetting perhaps that the War Minister was also General Hideki Tojo, Prime Minister and virtual dictator of wartime Japan. Tojo had had enough. Tanaka was transferred out to a frontline command in the south, the equivalent of banishment to Siberia for a high-ranking officer of the Imperial General Headquarters. Tojo, having re-established his control of the army, would never let it go again, as long as he held power. He made sure that the officers appointed to control the army were from that time on personally loyal to himself. From that moment, too, he also would be chief of the Imperial General Staff. The decision to move out of Guadalcanal had been made at the highest level, an Imperial General Headquarters conference in the Imperial Palace, with the Emperor in attendance with the capture of Guadalcanal in February. The Americans proclaimed a tremendous victory in the South Pacific. Guadalcanal, they would claim, marked the turning of the tide of the Pacific. War. The American invasion and final seizure of Guadalcanal was a victory of great importance. First of all, the 6-month struggle for Guadalcanal represented the initial Allied success on land against the Japanese Imperial Army. Until the summer of 1942, the Japanese forces in the Pacific were riding a tide of victory. Hong Kong, Singapore, the oil-rich islands of the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines had all fallen before the ever-victorious Imperial armies. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's Imperial Combined Fleet had destroyed the United States St. Battle Fleet at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and a few hours later it had knocked out British sea power in the Pacific off Singapore, with the sinking of the new battleship Prince of Wales and the old battlecruiser Repulse. A few weeks later, the Japanese carrier force engaged the British Asia Fleet of Trinom Salon, sank the carrier Hermes, and thus wiped out the most important remaining Allied force west of Hawaii. The last vestiges of organized Allied naval power were destroyed in the Battle of the Java Sea. Early in 1942, Burma fell, and the Imperial General Staff was deluged with plans for further expansion, including an attack on India, that was supposed to carry the Japanese forces across Afghanistan and the Caucasus to link up with Hitler's armies. Another plan called for an attack on the Russians in Siberia by the Kuk Kwantong Army, considered to be the best of all Japan's armies, but the Japanese victory had come as much more quickly than expected that the civil affairs people could not keep up. The army and navy were hard-pressed to consolidate their victories and build new bases. The most important naval base in the south was True, the key to the Bismarck archipelago, which had been held by the Japanese since World War I and been fortified for a long time. A new base was established at RAB on New Britain Island, which had been seized from the Australians. Plans were made to move onto the French territory of New Caledonia and into New Guinea. A few more ships, a few more armies at the outbreak of war, and the Japanese could have seized Australia. That was the Navy's dream. But in the spring of 1942, the vast length of the supply line and the spreading were simply changing emphasis. For several months they had been on the offensive in the Solomons area and on the defensive in Papua New Guinea. This would be reversed when it became apparent to Admiral Yamamoto that evacuation of the army troops on Guadalcanal was inevitable. He reorganized his command to begin a new offensive. Vice Admiral Jinichi Kusaka, the commander of the 11th Air Fleet at Rabaul, was put in charge of all naval units in the Bismarck Solomons and New Guinea. He began strengthening the bases at Munda on New Georgia and V on Kolombangara Island. One could not say that Admiral Yamamoto did not learn from his mistake. With the evacuation of Guadalcanal, Yamamoto drew a new front line, which ran through the middle of the Solomons. This was the line, said the Japanese optimistically, at which the enemy would be stopped immediately. The major problem was delivery of supplies during the last weeks of the Guadalcanal campaign. Supply to other bases was sadly neglected, and a great accumulation of war material had piled up on the docks at Rabaul. The old system, under which the army supplied its own troops in army transports and called for navy help only in emergency, would no longer do. That was the way of a victorious army, unused to serious opposition. In that sense, even the army understood that the war had changed, although the army stubbornly refused to change its basic plans, even after the major setbacks of the previous year at Guadalcanal and Bua on New Guinea, where General MacArthur had stopped the Japanese drive across the Owen Stanley Mountains. The Japanese build-up for the attack on Australia and New Guinea continued. Admiral Yamamoto had moved his advanced bases back to Kolombangara and New Georgia Islands, which were then to be prepared under the Japanese plans to provide the same sort of bases that had been envisaged for Guadalcanal staging points for air attacks on northern Australia, and the trade routes that brought supplies from America to General Douglas MacArthur's forces in Australia. Mather Arthur, former Chief of Staff of the United States Army, and a distinguished military son of a distinguished father, was well known to the Japanese, and they took seriously his promise that he would return to the Philippines. The movement against Australia was to make sure that MacArthur would be unable to carry out that promise, and although they had lost Guadalcanal, the Japanese retained one distinct advantage in the area. Their aircraft had longer range than those of the Americans, so they could send planes from Rabaul to New Georgia, where they would refuel, and then go on to attack the United States bases at Tulagi and Guadalcanal, and then return to Rabaul the same way the American PLS. The fighters in particular did not have the range to reach Rabaul and return to American bases. With the evacuation of Guadalcanal Imperial Headquarters in Tokyo, made plans to reinforce the area and retrieve the defeat. When the Emperor had agreed at the December 31st conference that Guadalcanal would be abandoned, he issued an imperial rescript to prepare the Japanese public for the change in plans. The Emperor is troubled by the great difficulties of the present war situation. The darkness is very deep, but dawn is about to break in the eastern sky today. The finest of the Japanese Empire's army, navy, and air units are gathering sooner or later. They will head toward the Solomon Islands, where a decisive battle is being fought between Japan and America, specifically Imperial Headquarters, then took steps to bring new forces south for that decisive battle. The staging area in French Indochina was enlarged. The China Command had promised a new offensive against Chiang Kai-shek for 1943, but that was scaled down to scarcely more than a raiding action. Planes, which were being destroyed at an alarming rate, were shifted from Manchuria and the Burma area to the South Pacific. The Japanese positions at Teore and in western New Guinea were reinforced. The point, as Admiral Yamamoto knew very well, was to regain the strategic initiative. Yamamoto had no hope for a long campaign, but he wanted to win one major victory, which would stop the Americans, and he hoped cause them to seek a negotiated peace that would leave Japan in control of her new Pacific Empire. In the past, Yamamoto had thought specifically in terms of a naval victory midway was the great opportunity for which he had planned. But after that failure, Yamamoto found himself bogged down in a war of attrition in the South Pacific that demanded the employment of large numbers of troops. That change had to mean a new cooperation between Army and Navy, because the Japanese Navy had only a few of the special shock troop units that were roughly equivalent to the United States Marines. In the assignment of areas of responsibility in the early days of the war, the Imperial General Staff had given the Army Formosa, the Philippines Mala, the Big East Indian Islands, and New Guinea. All of these were large land masses suitable for the employment of armoured forces. The Navy was given the task of defending the island groups such as the Marshalls, the Gilberts, and the Solomons. But when for the first time a large enemy land force went ashore on Guadalcanal, the defensive system was found to be inadequate. Yamamoto's first major error had been to send in a battalion to drive the Americans out of Guadalcanal. In that sense, the American raid on Meshin Island in the Gilberts, carried out by Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson's 2nd Marine Raider Battalion at the same time as the beginning of the Guadalcanal operation, was a psychological success. After all, the Americans had never before in this war launched an offensive operation. The Japanese failed to understand that Guadalcanal was just such an operation, and not another raid like that on the Gilberts. Also, the Japanese were so used to victory that their intelligence was sloppy, and as a consequence, Yamamoto sent in a battalion to do a job that demanded at least a division. When after several weeks the Japanese realized that they had a real problem on their hands and decided to rectify it, a whole set of negotiations between Army and Navy had to be undergone to dispatch the Army troops necessary. As noted, the Navy's land forces consisted of a few battalions of shock troops that functioned like American Marines to retake Guadalcanal. It would be necessary to employ many more men. They had to come from the 17th Army. An entirely new system of cooperation had to be established, and this change was not easily accomplished because the Japanese military traditionally had not worked that way. An endless series of meetings at Rabaul between Yamamoto's officers and those of the 17th Army brought forth a reluctant collaboration that was never as successful as it should have been. The concept the Americans employed, an area commander had authority over all sorts of troops, ships, and planes, was entirely foreign to the Japanese. The wasteful Japanese system of divided authority would continue. The cooperation in the South Pacific was forced uneasy and not completely effective in the battle for Guadalcanal. The Japanese had learned that transports simply did not have a chance in these waters. In the middle of November, the Army made its last large-scale logistical attempt in this area when it sent half a dozen transport toward Guadalcanal, loaded with troops and supplies of the 38th Division, only half the transports ever made. Guadalcanal, and the remainder were all bombed so severely that they had to be beached there. Many of the troops of the 38th Division arrived all right, but their guns and equipment did not, and neither did most of their food, instead of an asset. The division had become nearly a liability thereafter. For the rest of the Guadalcanal campaign, the Japanese supplied their forces only by destroyer and submarine. As of February 1943, there was no answer but that the combined fleet undertake management of the resupply of the forward bases as a regular responsibility. This meant the delivery of supplies to the Army forces in the area as well as the Navy zone. The first supply mission to the front lines was dispatched on February 13, 1944, just a week after the evacuation of Guadalcanal. Captain Kintaro Matsumoto was sent down to Kolombangara with 3 destroyers loaded with food, ammunition, and medical supplies. The Americans seemed unaware the ships made Kolombangara without incident, unloaded their supplies, and turned back toward Rabaul on the return trip. They were attacked by 8 fighters and 15 B-17 bombers, but all the bombs went awry and the 3 destroyers returned without loss. The mission was so successful that it gave the naval command a new sense of security. As far as the Japanese army was concerned, the important matter was the capture of all New Guinea. The Solomons were a navy problem of interest to the army now that Guadalcanal was evacuated, only because of a relatively small number of army troops stationed at various bases among the islands, and because of the enemy air and naval bases at Guadalcanal, that could threaten the whole New Guinea operation, the 38th Division, which had been sent near the end of the campaign to Guadalcanal and then evacuated, was moved back to Rabaul to defend that complex of bases, and all of New Island. The army lost no time in getting back into action, this time in New Guinea. Scarcely had the troops been removed from Guadalcanal, when plans for a new operation in Papua were prepared. It would begin in March 1943, with a renewed drive out of La in the area north of Australia, while the Americans did not have the same degree of separation between Navy and Army as the Japanese. They too had their difficulties. The division of the Southern Pacific battle region into two area commands was wasteful in itself, the result of the jealous struggle of the Army and Navy for command of the Pacific War. General MacArthur had been brought out of the Philippines to lead the Army forces back. Admiral Nimitz was the Pacific Fleet commander, and when Admiral King insisted on the invasion of Guadalcanal to forestall, the Japanese build-up Nimitz employed Marines, and insisted that the command be in the hands of a naval officer, so the Southwest Pacific Command of General MacArthur and the South Pacific Command of Admiral William F. White Jr. had come into being as separate entities. This anomalous situation continued throughout 1942 and into 1943 after Guadalcanal fell. The Joint Chiefs of Staff considered future operations in the area General George C. Marshall. Chief of Staff of the Army argued that command of forthcoming operations should be placed in General MacArthur's hands, but Admiral King stubbornly refused. That did not settle the issue. General George C. Arnold, commander of Army Air Forces, made an inspection trip to the South and Southwest Pacific and returned to say bluntly that the whole must be put under one commander and he must be an Army officer. Arnold proposed that the Joint Chiefs go to President Roosevelt and secure a presidential decree to that effect. Everyone recognized that General MacArthur's domineering personality was a problem, and several staff officers suggested that he be relieved and pushed into some such job as ambassador to Russia with MacArthur out of the way. They felt it would be easier to persuade the Navy to accept an Army area commander. The argument continued. The Army officers complained that the existence of divided commands was counterproductive and confusing. General Marshall told President Roosevelt that further unification of the South Pacific Command and Southwest Pacific Command was badly needed. Admiral King would not give an inch, and Roosevelt let the matter lie, so the operations in the Southern Pacific area continued to be divided under the commands of Admiral Holly and General MacArthur. On the lower levels there were other complaints. General Arnold said the Navy men did not know how to handle land-based air operations. King ordered Nimitz to strengthen the land-based air command in the South Pacific. Guadalcanal was invaded by the 1st Marine Division with elements of the 2nd Marine Division in reserve. Two of those regiments, the 2nd Marine Regiment and the 8th Marine Regiment, fought in the Guadalcanal campaign, worn down by heat and disease as much as by the Japanese. Most of these troops were supplanted by Army units that became available in the area at the end of 1942, and Army Major General Alexander P.C.H. became the field commander of United States Land Forces on Guadalcanal here, then for the first time in the Pacific War, was an Army general serving in command of land forces in battle under a Navy admiral. Because of Admiral Holly's enormous ability as a commander, the friction was not serious at that level, but lower down. It was a constant problem. Major General John Maron, commander of the 2nd Marine Division, outranked Army General Patch by seniority. Part of his division remained in the fighting on Guadalcanal until the last, but Maron was kept sequestered in Wellington, New Zealand. If he had gone to Guadalcanal as senior officer, he would have taken charge of operations, and the confusion would have been enormous. The American system was superior to the Japanese, but it was far from perfect. The problems of command between Marine and Army officers would persist through most of the Pacific War late in November, when the tide at Guadalcanal seemed to have turned in favor of the Americans. The Joint Chiefs of Staff gave more attention to the next stage of operations. This would be complicated, the nature dictated by the structure of the commands. There was another problem which would be resolved in January at the Casablanca Conference. There, the Allied leaders would decide that the grand strategy of the global war called for continued British and American emphasis on the European theatre, and that during the coming year, Again, only limited resources could be spared for the Pacific, given very little with which to work. The Americans were supposed to carry the war against the Japanese, not just stop them, but begin throwing them back, given such limited resources. The most daring plan of all, to bypass the whole southern area and attack inside the Inner Empire, was vetoed by Admiral Nimitz as much too risky. The next move was to be up the Solomons, then to the northeast coast of New Guinea, New Britain, and New Ireland. Each operation would involve a task force, and whether this was South Pacific Holly or Southwest Pacific MacArthur would be decided in each case by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. As for the overall strategic direction of the campaign, General Marshall proposed that it be MacArthur's. This had been the original plan of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The South Pacific Command had been ordered only to take Guadalcanal, and Tagi Marsh recalled this directive, but King disagreed again. The next move should be in the northwest, perhaps outflanking some of the Japanese-held islands, and it should be under the South Pacific Command, which in turn would be directly responsible to Nimitz's Pacific Fleet and Pacific Ocean Areas Command. But Nimitz in turn disagreed with Admiral King's haste. He also shared Admiral Yamamoto's premise that the battle for Guadalcanal had not ended, and that the island was still in danger of recapture. As long as the Japanese held the adjacent northern Solomons, they had to be cleaned out, and Tulagi had to be turned into a major base for operations. The Japanese string of air and naval bases ran down the Solomons, and they were mutually supporting it. Would be too dangerous to bypass Cavan Rabal Buabuen. And the rest, Nimitz urged the Joint Chiefs of Staff to go slow and build up the forces before making a major move. Admiral Nimitz's assessment of the situation in the Solomons as of February 1943 was very close to that of Admiral Yamamoto, who had retreated no further than Munda on New Georgia as his forward point of defense in meetings in Rabul Yamamoto, and General Hitoshi Imamura, the Southeast Area Commander, worked out their plans. Imamura would be responsible for operations in New Guinea. Yamamoto would be responsible for operations in the Solomons and the defense of Rabaul. As it turned out, this command structure was almost precisely the counterpart of the American, with Holly in charge of South Pacific operations up the Solomons chain, and MacArthur moving against the Japanese in New Guinea. Like MacArthur, the Japanese army was more concerned with New Guinea than with the Solomons, the entire purpose of the operation of May that had resulted in the Coral Sea. Battle had been the investment of Port Moresby in Papua, the southern portion of New Guinea. Only incidentally had troops been landed in the Solomons to build a seaplane base at Tulagi and an airfield on Guadalcanal. The first purpose of the bases would have been to protect the movement into southern New Guinea and launch raids on Australia to weaken the Allies' capacity to move troops. The Japanese army also had its eyes on New Caledonia and Samoa as points in the ring around Australia and New Zealand. But first of all, in the army view, Papua Southern New Guinea must be reinforced as cleared of the Allied troops that General MacArthur had moved in there. The campaign for Papua had begun before that. For Guadalcanal, the Japanese had sent an amphibious force from Rabaul in July 1942, and on July 20th the troops had landed under Allied air attack just west of Bua on the north shore of the Papuan Peninsula. By the time the American Marines attacked Guadalcanal, the Japanese army was already reinforcing Papua and had about 11,000 men ashore. General Imamura's attention then was focused on this area, which was the next destination in his war plan. That preoccupation was one of the major reasons for the Japanese army's failure to understand the Guadalcanal threat, and to respond to it, Imamura was preoccupied with a striking force he sent over the Owen Stanley Mountains from northern New Guinea to attack Port Moresby, which was defended by only a handful of Australian troops, but MacArthur managed to bring in 10,000 reinforcements, most of them Australians, by the middle of August 1942. The Japanese reinforced their troops again, so did the Allies, and the battle raged for months. It was on a smaller scale than that of Guadalcanal, but still was regarded by General Imamura as of far more importance. This army myopia continued until December, when a shocked military command learned that for the first time in history, the Imperial Japanese Navy could not guarantee resupply L of a Japanese army invasion force, the Navy men on both sides. It seemed thought much along the same lines as did the army men. Admirals King and Nimitz insisted that as long as the Solomons were occupied by the enemy, they were a threat to any operation, and thus they must be cleared. Yamamoto shared their view. Although his goal was to regain the lost ground, the first Japanese task had to be to re-establish air superiority lost in the Battle of Guadalcanal in February 1943. Holding that air superiority in the southern Solomons, Admiral Holly was already preparing to attack his next objective, the Russell Islands just north of Guadalcanal. He wanted these islands as a base for motor torpedo boats. No one regarded this operation as major, but it was still useful to move a little up the chain of the Solomons in a hurry, and nothing could be done about the major moves until higher authority agreed on the command problem. At the moment, there was no way the Joint Chiefs of Staff could come to grips with the problem of area command. The rivalry between Army and Navy always got in the way. The Joint Chiefs of Staff consisted of 2 generals and 2 admirals. General Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Arnold, Chief of Staff of the Air Command. It was still part of the Army and was called the Army Air Forces Admiral King, who held the odd title of Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, and Admiral William D. Lay. President Roosevelt's and principal military advisor, equally split the Joint Chiefs, could never agree on the subject of overall command. If there was to be a unified command, the directive would have to come from President Roosevelt, the Commander-in-Chief of all the armed forces. At that moment, Roosevelt was primarily concerned with the prosecution of the war against the Germans, and all that effort involved the war in the Pacific was proceeding in a relatively satisfactory fashion, and in his usual way, Roosevelt saw nothing wrong in internal conflict among his departments. Up to a point, as an old Navy buff, former Assistant Secretary of the Navy Roosevelt, was aware of the intense rivalry between Army and Navy for the leadership of the campaign against the Japanese. The Army plan called for the return through the Philippines, but the Navy plan called for the move against Japan through the Central Pacific. The matter was further complicated by the emergence of the aerial force in this war as an equivalent in importance to an army or a fleet. The air generals and the air admirals vied for control of the land-based air forces that provided most of the striking force. Still, until the resources became available to press in at least one direction, there was no need to decide between admirals and generals given the limited objectives for the first part of the year, 1943. Roosevelt saw no need to make any decision about commands, and that is the way he left it. Admiral Nimitz was still commander of the Pacific Fleet, which meant all the ships everywhere. General MacArthur was still commander of the Southwest Pacific, which meant the whole area south and west of the Philippines. The original scene of Allied attempts to fight back in 1942, the matter was further complicated by Nimitz's other hat, that of commander of the Pacific Ocean areas. Originally, this title had been conceived to give Nimitz command of the stray islands in the North and Central Pacific Ocean. Admiral King saw far more in the concept at the same time that King insisted on the absolute need for a fast response to the Japanese at Guadalcanal. He had declared that the Guadalcanal invasion belonged to Nimitz by right of the Pacific Ocean area's title that was logical, because since August 1942 King was providing the transports, the bombardment force, the covering fleet and aircraft and the invasion army, the Marines there, wasn't much the generals could do about it, although King's move strained every resource of the Navy in the Pacific. It was a brilliant ploy in the political battle for control of the Pacific War effort. It had created the situation that existed in the early months of 1943, when MacArthur could not simply assert the authority given him in the original Joint Chiefs of Staff directive and take command of the new operations. It was all a part of Admiral King's determination. Spruance and would become the nucleus of the Central Pacific Invasion Force, and the 7th Fleet, which was placed at about this time under Vice Admiral Thomas C. Kincaid. At long last, MacArthur had the sort of naval force he had been hoping for, but Nimitz had sewed up its ultimate control and retained it in his own hands. Above all, he kept control of the growing force of fast carriers which would be assigned to various fleets for specific operations and then brought back to Pearl Harbor. The March meeting was greeted with satisfaction by all concerned, and within a month Admiral Holly made a trip to Brisbane to call on MacArthur, and thus attest to MacArthur's overall command and assuage the general's ego. Nimitz had worked it all out so that Holly could do everything he wanted to do with virtually no interference from Brisbane. High was ready to begin operations up the slot by 1943. The words South Pacific had a magic ring in America as the campaign progressed. This first offensive action against the apparently invincible Japanese Americans at home seemed to sense that the war was changing drastically as the foot soldiers and the airmen turned the tide. They found themselves lionized at home. The Navy seesaw battle for control of the slot kept Americans rooting as at an athletic contest. Indeed, one of the most popular American tunes of the day was Knuckle Down Winaki, in which the lyrics urged a mythical school football team onto greater efforts in the face of apparent defeat and heavy odds. The odds began to, even as ever more American ships and men were found for the South Pacific battle, and the men came eagerly to the island paradise, dreaming of dusky, dark-haired beauties basking beneath palm trees, and under a clear evening sky, the ships came first to Numa, New Caledonia. This was the headquarters of the South Pacific Command. It was also French territory, and the French here were cranky and unpleasant to give them their due. The government of the islands was in a most difficult position. Secretly, most of the French sympathized with the home government at Vichy, which was in league with the Germans for reasons of international politics. The Americans and Australians had not simply declared an Allied occupation of New Caledonia, but had chosen the harder road of dealing with the French, who did not like the occupation. But if the French became too difficult, the Americans could simply throw them out and probably into jail, so the French pretended to cooperate with the Americans, but in fact did all they could to make life miserable. They did a thorough job at first. Admiral Holly had operated from his flagship, the Argonne in Noumea Harbour headquarters, was then set up in an old warehouse on the waterfront, where the expanding staff was crammed into the tin building like a mess of anchovies. Holly set up shop in the abandoned Japanese consulate on top of the hill, as a ship came in from the east to the lighthouse that marked the barrier reef, and the channel the sailors looked dreamily on this land of promise. Some of them, with the tales of Robert Louis Stevenson echoing in their minds, the ship stopped, and the French pilot came aboard and took them inside to Neuer Harbour to anchor. The harbour was filled with a motley collection of craft. Old Dutch transports, Australian and American troop ships, battle wagons, a handful of auxiliary carriers, cruisers, destroyers, ammunition ships and oilers. In all its years, Numa had never been so busy. From the harbour, the white and red and yellow of the city's buildings stood against the green growth of the tropics. It looked lush and inviting. "This port is attractive when viewed from a distance," wrote one hope-filled sailor as his ship anchored on the edge of the line, "and the climate is ideal, something like Florida." That night, he and his shipmates basked happily on deck, enjoying the new climate. The next day they went ashore for a few hours. What a dump, the sailor wrote that second day. In comparison, Re-Icy Iceland is Nana. He had seen his dusky beauties in their home environment. Splay-footed Melanesians scattering in a PWA some fly-blown stores with their shelves empty, and a general air of dejected lassitude that was his tropical paradise. The impression would grow worse, and after a few days his ship headed north toward the war zone as they moved to F8 in the new herds. The wind came blasting at them, a searing wind that carried thousands of flies. It was so hot that most of the men abandoned their bunks and tried to sleep on deck. They reached eat. And another disappointment, even the Officers' Club of Havana Harbour was dubbed Malaria Manor. They were now in the real South Pacific, the South Pacific of mud, and Melanesians, cannibals and crocodiles, where the green of the jungle dripped water and crotch rot. Their recreation consisted of swimming offshore from the ship or going inshore to drink warm beer and walk around in the mud. Guadalcanal, they would find, was the worst of all the scores of Japanese and Allied warships sunk in Iron Bottom Sound, sent a constant trickle of oil to the surface of the water, and it drifted to shore, and on those few days when the wind was right and the beach was clear, there was always the danger of sharks and sea-going crocodiles that had developed a nice taste for human flesh in clearing up the results of the carnage of the 6 months of sea battles. In the middle of January, Admiral Nimitz arrived in the South Pacific. It was his second visit to the war zone, and this time he brought Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox on an inspection trip. They travelled in Nimitz's big Catalina flying boat. They stayed aboard various warships in conditions that were luxurious compared to those ashore on the beach. Even Admiral Kelly Turner, the senior officer on Guadalcanal, was lucky to have a hut with a plywood floor and half walls, mud flies. Mosquitoes, humidity, heat, and fear of Japanese air raids dominated life up country in New Georgia and beyond. It was the same in reverse for the Japanese. They had a word for the climate unmatched in English mushatsui buggy hot. While Secretary KNX looked around, Admiral Nimitz had a chance to talk over plans for the forthcoming operations with Admiral Holly. They were agreed that it would be 3 months before. A major operation could be launched, but Holly wanted to keep moving for several reasons, not the least of which was to retain the initiative and maintain the morale he had brought from a dead low to a victorious pitch when Guadalcanal was secured. He wanted to take the Russell Islands, which lay just 30 miles northwest of Cape Esperance, in late January, still unmindful of the Japanese plan of evacuation of all troops south of New Georgia. Admiral Holly expected that the 5,000 or 6,000 troops reported to be in the Russell would remain and fight for the safety of the Guadalcanal garrison and Henderson Field. They must be dislodged, then the Russ could be used by American PT boats. That was the official explanation for the coming operation. More important to High was the practice it would offer for his adolescent amphibious force Admiral Turner. The amphibious commander had more experience in amphibious operations than any other man in the Pacific. That wasn't saying much. His major effort had been the Guadalcanal landings and resupply, and the conditions of those efforts were not likely to be repeated. The Japanese Jays had been taken by surprise in August when the initial landing was staged. Thereafter they had reacted furiously, and the Guadalcanal campaign had become a slugging match. What Turner must practice were new techniques, using new sorts of craft to land troops in a hurry and get the supplies onto the beaches. Admiral Nimitz understood what was in Hall's mind, and he offered no complaint, although it seemed obvious that for its own sake the territory was hardly worth much effort in Washington. The NAV's commander Admiral King questioned the whole affair, but Holly stood his ground and Nimitz backed him up without telling King precisely why. So on February 7th, the day the Japanese left Guadalcanal without knowing of the evacuation, High ordered the invasion of the Russell Islands, which consisted of vast tracts of coconut trees belonging to the Elvere brothers, soap people and even vaster areas of mud. The Russell were to have a first-class invasion, which was called Slate, when Admiral Turner set up camp near KY Point on Guadalcanal. Even headquarters was built of plywood-floored huts. It was called Camp Crocodile, and it would be the home of the 3rd Fleet's amphibious command. For the next year, Turner's job was to stage an invasion. Using small vessels, he would test out new landing craft, particularly the small amphibious amp tracks that could leave the side of a ship and carry men into the beaches, theoretically, without even getting their feet wet. The composition of the attacking troop force indicated the greatest problem in the South Pacific. Just then, the shortage of trained units of fighting men this assault force was as mixed a bag as had ever been sent out. Most of the Army 43rd Infantry Division, a third of the 11th Marine Defense Battalion, the 10th Marine Defense Battalion, the 3rd Marine Raider Battalion, and part of the 35th Naval Construction Battalion CBS, a naval boat pool organization, 8 PT boats, and a number of small artillery units which had been begged from other commands the troops. And equipment came from New Colonia, Florida Island, Espiritu Santo Tulagi, and from the States the reserve was an Army regimental combat team undesignated from the 24th Corps on Guadalcanal on February 9th, as Admiral Turner was assembling his far-flung force at Guadalcanal. The word came that the Japanese had evacuated aided the Russell, but the plan was in motion and it would continue a few days later. A convoy left Numa carrying a number of the troops bound for the Russell. First they would move to Guadalcanal, and then the convoy would become part of the invasion force. The convoy consisted of the transports President Jackson, President Adams, President Hayes, Crescent City, and Tula, accompanied by half a dozen destroyers on the morning of February 177, as the convoy approached the Solomons from the south, The escorting destroyers picked up several unidentified aircraft on their radar sets. The contacts persisted all day, although the shadowing planes kept carefully out of range by afternoon. The convoy commander, Captain Ingolf N. Keeland, was certain that these were not random contacts, but enemy planes shadowing the convoy, and that the convoy could expect an air attack if the Japanese followed the pattern they had already established. The attack would come at dark. Captain Keeland made preparations to fend off an air attack. He ordered additional 50 caliber and 30 caliber machine guns set up on deck and in the landing boats to be manned by the troops the ships were carrying to Guadalcanal at 6 o'clock that evening. In the gloaming, he ordered the gun crews alerted using the talk between ships. Communication system Captain Keeland ordered the gunners to open fire without notice on any aircraft they saw just before darkness fell. One destroyer reported clear contact with two planes at 11 minutes past 7. The black of night was suddenly broken by a bright white flare that exposed the entire convoy. At that time, the convoy was travelling in a closed formation of 3 columns. The columns 1,000 yards apart, and the ships maintaining a distance apart in each column of 600 yards, the convoy had then reached a position about 20 miles south of the Little Solomon, an island of Santa Ana. The convoy was following the usual zigzagging pattern. Immediately, the convoy commander ordered a radical change in tactics. The zigzag ceased, the ships increased the intervals from 600 to 800 yards, and they began manoeuvring violently in 45 degrees turns. That first flare was followed by others, and by white float lights dropped on the water on all sides of the convoy. The enemy shadows were doing a good job of outlining the area, but for whom, as the minutes passed and there was no sign of the enemy. But those flares and float lights, the tension grew almost unbearable. Captain Keeland sent messages to Admiral High's headquarters and to Guadalcanal to ask for air protection. The destroyers had been operating as an anti-submarine screen rotating around the convoy at a distance of 2,500 yards. These enemy preparations indicated a bombing attack, so the destroyers were moved in close to the convoy to add their gun power to that of the transports. The moon appeared bright and clear behind a layer of high catus clouds that covered the sky, diffusing the moonlight and giving the moon an eerie halo. The minutes crept by, and nothing happened until 7:43 p.m. Then a green flare appeared directly over the convoy and burst into a cluster of 8 green flares. One of the destroyers began firing with its main battery. Other ships also began firing until the gunners realized they were firing at the anti-aircraft burst of the destroyer. The guns all stopped, and the tension began again, and at 8 o'clock the radar operators saw 7 blips coming in from the south, 12 miles away. The spotter planes were still up there. Overhead, dropping more flares, the destroyers began firing again. Directed by radar, Captain Keeland moved the convoy away from the angle of attack to make it more difficult for the bombers as the Japanese planes began to appear. The Americans saw that they were twin-engine Betty Mitsub, fishy bombers of the all-purpose type. These had been modified for torpedo work. This torpedo attack was badly coordinated. Good technique called for the formation to stick together until the moment of attack, and then for the planes to peel off and come in from several directions in the hope of confusing the gunners and at least diluting the fire against any one plane, but these torpedo planes split up too soon and thus made individual targets for the gunners. The first plane appeared near the convoy 5 minutes after the 7 bombers had been sighted at 8:06 p.m. The destroyer Drayton's lookouts spotted a plane coming in on her starboard beam until it was on a line with the transports. The Drayton's gunners opened fire but did not see any hits, and when the plane neared the transports, however, they opened fire, and the Japanese bomber turned on a wing and slid into the sea, erupting in a geyser of flame. 2 minutes later, that Japanese bomber was followed by another. This came in on the port bow of the Drayon. Her gunners opened fire, as did those of another destroyer nearby, and the plane crashed into the water. Another plane bored in, and another, and the guns of the ships were turned on them as they came one by one. The Japanese planes fell each flaming into the sea and burning on the water until 5 yellow flares had been added to the white ones. The fires spread across the water and continued to burn. and convoy commander Keeland moved away from them, for they silhouetted his ships. The attack reached its height 20 minutes after it began, and then suddenly it was over, and no damage had been suffered by the convoy. The officers of the destroyers reported hearing the sounds of torpedo propellers underwater and explosions that must have been torpedoes at the end of the run, but only the Crescent City's skipper noted any close explosions. He reported a heavy explosion at the height of the attack, but it did no damage, and he decided it must have been a spent torpedo going off nearby. Probably the ship most endangered was the President Adams. Her captain reported seeing a torpedo dropped 400 yards off her bow. It came up, pupping, and then sank just 25 yards ahead of the ship's bow. The plane that had dropped the torpedo banked sharply to the right and passed directly over the President Adams. The plane had already been hit, and the gunners of the transport saw smoke trailing from its engines. They scored more hits, and the plane glided into the sea, where it caught fire and burned 5 minutes after the attack ended. 2 Peaby patrol bombers arrived from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. They were carrying flares which they expected to drop some distance from the convoy, and thus to confuse the enemy torpedo bombers. But there was no need. The attack had ended for the night a total failure for the Japanese, and a most welcome success for the Americans, because, for the first time, a rarely lightly armoured convoy had come through a major attack without a scratch. The invasion of the Russell Islands was sheer anticlimax. Admiral Turner's ships and small craft and the escorting task force left Lunga roads at Guadalcanal on the night of February 20th and steamed without incident. They reached the Russell by dawn. An advanced force had already announced that the Japanese were gone and they had not come back, so it was simply a matter of bringing the men and equipment ashore and setting up camp in the next week. 9,000 men were brought to the islands to begin construction of an airbase and naval facilities for PT boats and other craft. The Japanese, meanwhile, were building up their forces at New Georgia and on Kolombangara across Kola Gulf. Admiral Yamamoto didn't intend to let the Americans on Guadalcanal rest, and was already asking for more planes to reinvigorate his air attacks on Guadalcanal. From 4 bases located at Rabaul, the bombers' fighters could stage down to Little Booker Island at the northern tip of Banville, which housed an air base. Another was located at Kahili near Buen at the southern end of Banville. With a naval base and seaplane base, there was another air base on Balal, and then one at V and another at Munda on New Georgia. The tables had been turned. However, in the naval sense, it was now the Japanese who were finding difficulties in running their supply missions to the southernmost bases through an American air and sea gauntlet. Vice Admiral Aubrey W. Fitch, who had fought the Battle of the Coral Sea, was commander of H's land-based air forces. His headquarters was located at Espiritu Santo, next to the Pulo airfield, but the main air base for H's assault on the Japanese in the northern Solomons was Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. 1 fighter strip had been built during the heat of the campaign for the island, and another. A little later, bomber strips were now added around Koi Point. Guadalcanal bristled with anti-aircraft guns, and the strips were always full of bombers and fighters just before the Russell's landing. Rear Admiral Charles P. Mason was moved up to Guadalcanal with a brand new job as Commander Aircraft Solomons Islands. High now had more than 300 aircraft on Guadalcanal, and for the first time since the campaign began, there seemed to be enough of everything the Black Cat night fighters had made their appearance, and they would add a new dimension to the air war. Not nearly as many of the Japanese KN fighters the Geckos ever got into action, as did the Black Cats in the air. The tables were almost completely turned on the Japanese, and at C6 American task forces stood ready to accept any Japanese challenge. It was the Americans now who came by night to bombard Japanese airfields, as the Japanese had bombarded Henderson Field in the summer and fall of 1942. In February, planes from Admiral Fitz's force and others from General MacArthur's command bombed the Japanese airfields from Rabaul to Munda.